Today's podcast is on the death list. Everybody's got a death list. No one admits to it, but of course we do. There are people that we would like to see dead on it, and there are people who we think should belong on it, and those who shouldn't. Everyone has their own subjective criteria for determining. And I thought it would be very apropos to discuss whether or not Martin Shkreli, Shkreli, merits being on the death list. Now, to be clear, I'm not advocating that he be murdered. I'm not advocating that anyone take any harm or perform anything illegal against him. I just want to debate the ethics and the morality of this gentleman and the business model that he introduces and the consequences for the greater good of his actions. The whole purpose of this podcast is to bring to the forefront the ethical question and discussion about his particular type of value sets and judgments, and whether or not, as many people feel, he deserves to be exterminated. Others don't. And I've spoken to a lot of people, and many of them feel a good chunk that he's just a waste of oxygen. And just as many people feel that he's an entrepreneur and has every right to generate as much income as he can. And somewhere in the middle, a lot of people are saying the ethical constraints that he uses to make his money on the misery of others merits discussion, and whether or not he should be permitted to continue to what he's doing. So the whole idea of the death list is whether or not the moral construct to allow and permit his behavior, his conduct, his activity, because he has impacts on millions of people, and should he be stopped against his will. Now, for clarity, this is 19 December 2015, so events are unfolding very, very quickly. That's understood. But at the very moment, I'd just like to give you a little bit of background on who Martin Shkreli is, and then we can discuss the ethics of his case. Let's see, he was born in April 1983 to a pair of Albanian immigrants. He was born in the Bronx in New York. He attended Baruch College in New York City. I'm not sure if he received a degree or not. He spent 4 years with a firm, Kramer Berkowitz. He purchased or created his first hedge fund, ELEA Capital Management, in 2006. A judgment was issued against him for $2.3 million by Lehman Brothers in 2007. He became chairman of the board of the National Albanian American Council. That's a nonprofit advocacy group. He purchased his second hedge fund, MSMB Capital Management, in 2009. He founded his first pharma company, Retrofin, in 2011. He was removed from the board of Retrofin by the directors in 2014. I think he quit thereafter. He founded Turing Pharmaceutical in February 2015. And he became infamous. He came on the radar when he purchased a drug called Daraprim, Daraprim. It's an antiparasitic that had long expired on its intellectual property. The initial patent holders didn't have any ownership to it. He purchased the rights, and he instantly jacked up the price of this very successful, very popular antiparasitic drug by 5,500%. It went from $13.50 per pill, which is expensive but affordable, to $750 a pill. And the idea of that was to generate capital. More about that later. So he became CEO of an acquired company, Calobios, Kalobios, in November 2015. He was arrested by the Bureau on 7/17 for securities fraud, allegedly, while he was with MSMB in a Ponzi scheme. So that's sort of the background history of Mr. Shkreli. I'm not sure whether he's married or single. He's a young man in his 30s. But a couple things come up to mind. The whole idea of forcing someone to stop what they're doing against their will in the name of the greater good. And before we talk about Shkreli's case, I want to bring up a couple of good examples that kind of set the mindset. The first one, and I think one of the most important one, is Gaetan Dugas, D-U-G-A-S. He was known as Patient Zero. He was a Canadian, came from Quebec. He died 30 March 1984. He was a flight attendant by profession, and he was credited with being one of the very first HIV/AIDS carriers. And the Canadian health ministries and all their associations, which are exceedingly progressive, as they were treating him, quickly realized that he had an infectious disease. They weren't quite sure what Mr. Dugas had, but they knew it was infectious and it was deadly. And he was an openly gay man who had quite an extensive social life, very promiscuous sexual partners, made no bones about hiding it whatsoever, and absolutely steadfastly refused to adhere to the request, the adamant request by his physicians and the Canadian Health Ministry to abstain from both sexual activity and any other activity that could result in the transmission of what we now know as the HIV/AIDS virus. He absolutely refused. And the Canadians, being very progressive folks, took that seriously, and they either put it to a referendum or they brought it to some sort of public discussion. I'm not clear how. But after a substantial effort, the Canadian government, in all its proper legal jurisdictions, ruled that this gentleman, Mr. Dugas, could not be held against his will, even knowing full well that he fully intended to continue his promiscuous lifestyle, which would cause infectious transmission. And I think at that time, they knew that he had infectious disease. I don't think they quite understood the severity of that. And he was, of course, permitted to go. He was released, and he, true to his own words, he went right out and continued his very active sexual life, knowing fully well that he was infected with a terrible virus, a deadly one at that. I don't believe he shared that with many, if any, of his partners. Very promiscuous sexual activity. And being a travel person, a flight attendant, he traversed the globe and was credited with the killing of millions of people. He was individually identified by many folks in case studies as being directly responsible for the infection and the disease of millions of people. And as we all know, HIV is extremely deadly, and it wasn't up until just a few years ago that it wasn't 100% lethal. There's mitigation to it now, but still it's quite a heavy medical toll to have this disease. Anyway, that's Gaetan Dugas. The other person that I'd like to discuss is Typhoid Mary. Everybody who remember reading their history books, She was an Irish immigrant who came to New York. She died in November 1938. She was credited with infecting 51 people with typhoid. And at the time, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, typhoid, of course, was a highly infectious disease and was deadly. And the health officials in New York City forced Typhoid Mary into isolation. She was quarantined against her will and spent over 30 years at the Riverside Hospital and other facilities in forced quarantine when she eventually died after 30 years. And all the epidemiology typically credit her with infecting 51 people who all died. That's an example of forced isolation where quarantine was imposed upon the individual for the greater good. Patient zero, Gaetan Dugas, was the total opposite. And we can see the relationships of what is considered by many to be failure of governments to maintain the safety and the well-being and the health of the populace in general at the price of one. Or others can look at the flip coin and say, oh no, no government has the right to tell one individual to do the other regardless of the potential of harm. That's the sort of argument. And the third and final case example I'd like to bring is the trolley problem, quote unquote. And it's a famous moral dilemma problem, most recently reenacted by the University of Michigan study. And the trolley problem is an age-old moral dilemma where you have an individual, you have a hiker on the railroad track, and he's walking towards it, and then you have these subjects who are told that they have the ability to control several things. One is they can kill the hiker, move him away from the train tracks. There's just the loss of one life. And all the passengers, the thousands of passengers on the trains, or hundreds of passengers on the train, are saved. Or do you save the hiker and destroy all the passengers on the train? Simple as that. And that trolley problem has been run and executed numerous times by different universities and organizations. And typically, regardless of nationality or ethnicity, about 90% of the subjects who took the trolley problem scenario, 90% instinctively agreed to kill the hiker in order to benefit the passengers of the train. The death of one for the good of the many. And now that we've discussed all those three criterias, the key question is whether or not Shkreli, who is that one guy on the rail, deserves to be either be quarantined against his will or allowed to do as he wishes. Now, this is not just a businessman here. This is a person who purchases and controls the manufacturing and distribution of medication, which is critical to life, especially in infectious disease, but also in cancer pharmaceuticals and other dire, critical medications. And he jacks those prices up for one purpose only, and that is profit. And when he does that, he eliminates the possibility of the lower rungs of our society. We have 7 billion humans on this planet. And I think at least 2, if not 3 of them are below the poverty line in any way you cut it. He's affecting billions or hundreds of millions of people. Let's assume hundreds of millions. And if a percentage of those cannot afford to take these drugs, then he is individually causing unnecessarily the loss of human life for profit. That's the argument. Do we let him do it? Or do we intervene against him, like Typhoid Mary, and quarantine him in prison, or other people feel just snuff him out? That's the moral, ethical dilemma. I'd love to know what you think. Send me a text message on the YouTube. Thank you very much.